get away, then obviously we'll try and speed it up a little bit as well, so you don't miss too much. Yeah. Basically, it's a pretty important topic. And as John said, it is International Men's Day, isn't it? And there is a debate in Parliament today, I think.
There is, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so
the 19th is the...
Sorry?
International Men's Day is the 19th, but they had the debate today.
Yeah, had a debate today, yeah. Which is good news. So I've been working with the Samaritans for many years, as probably need to know, give me some context. I won't go into all my background. This is just stuff I always say at these kind of talks, because it does, unfortunately, it's an emotive subject, and we want to just get it clear. This is a very inclusive approach. You know, we want to promote the understanding of one gender. It doesn't imply a lack of concern for the other. It's just that we're focusing on men because for obvious reasons. But sometimes I get a little in the way when people sort of say, you know, why are you focusing on men? And I say, well, if you focus on children, no one says, why aren't you focusing on old people? They just, they're specialists. And of course, I spent my whole career working mainly with women, because as we'll find out, as we all know, women turn up for help more in the NHS and counselling services than men. So I specialised in women more than men, but as I got into my 40s and 50s, realising I need to think about men as having a gender in the same way, and one of the differences. So understanding both genders is very important to understand humanity. Gender's emotive, but then everything is really, it should be. Anything worth thinking about is emotive. Gender difference doesn't imply common humanity, so men and women equally human. But these could... Hi, please come in, grab a seat. We've only just started because of technical difficulties, so you haven't really missed very much.
Lovely, thank you.
So I say diversity. For me, gender is a diversity and an equality issue. Because you're interested in difference and diversity doesn't mean to say you're not interested in equality too. It's both, as it would be with any other area of life. So suicide is a massive killer, okay? So just looking at the most common cause of death, for men aged 20 to 49, it is actually the most common cause of death, even above all the sort of physical diseases. So that's quite amazing when you think about it. Taking your own life is the most common cause of death. Also for women aged 20 to 34, so, you know, it's a big issue. Oh yeah.
Hello. Okay, right. So is that better? Okay. So yeah, for women, it's a big killer as well between the ages of 20 and 34. Suicide is the second most common cause of death for teenage males, and it's the sixth for females. So basically, it's pretty much the biggest killer for males from teenage years through to about 50. I mean, that's a massive thing in our health, in public health. It's a huge public health issue. But if you look at the Public Health England strategic plan, I don't know if you have, these things can be rather dry. It doesn't hardly mention mental health, you know, suicide, you know, let alone suicide. And it's talking really about physical health and obesity and lifestyle choices and all that stuff. It doesn't really feature mental health as part of an integrated part of all health, even though we talk about parity of mental and physical health. So I want to talk about two blindnesses in health, you know, when it comes to male suicide that we need to think about. The first is mind blindness. As a society, we're not very psychologically literate. All of our health science policy research, everything focuses on the brain, not the mind. In fact, we have a sort of scientific culture which assumes that the mind is something soft. If you study the mind, you're not a proper scientist. If you study the brain, you are a proper scientist. So there's a whole thing by which psychological data become seen as second-class data. Mental health is only referred to, therefore, in medicalised terms as a set of disorders, and it's not seen as part of the human condition, except as a sort of secondary thing. So this is why the public health strategy is so physicalised. It's based on physical assumptions. So really, when you look at public health in this country, if you're a public health expert, you'd really expect to be wanting to look at suicide as a massive thing in society. How do we prevent it? What do we do with our early relationships? What do we do with everything that relates to people's self-worth in society? But no, it just comes down to diet, behaviour, lifestyle. There isn't much curiosity about people's psychology in our public health strategy. We see mental illness as a cause of suicide. We put this sort of layer of explanation that people are suffering from mental illnesses, which is a false model, because if you think about it, having low self-esteem, is that a symptom of an illness called depression, or is feeling depressed simply the result of having low self-esteem? I mean, if you have low self-esteem, you're going to feel depressed. So we need to look at the causes of esteem, but our public health people are all trying to root out depression, which is a mythical thing. What is prevalent in our society is low self-esteem amongst people because of various reasons. You know, obvious reasons like not having a job or not being loved by your parents. These are quite big things. Being abandoned as a kid or being traumatised and abused. So really, public policy, because it's mind-blind, it's ignoring all the data. I mean, I worked in the health service for 30 years, and everyone with a serious mental health problem had these kind of problems. They had abuse, trauma, neglect as kids. They didn't just have magical illnesses that came out of nowhere. They had the life story which made them vulnerable to feeling bad about themselves. Not just vulnerable, but it caused them to feel bad about themselves. If you're abused and neglected as a kid, you're going to feel bad about yourself. And yet public policy ignores the role of attachments, trauma, abuse, bullying. It doesn't connect all these things to mental health directly. And therefore, even when it's providing treatments for people who have mental health problems, it doesn't value relationships. So you might see a different doctor every time you go. You might see a different, you never end up with the same person trying to help you in mental health. So you don't build up a secure attachment to start feeling better about yourself. You just keep going around a revolving door. So our mental health services are medicalised and depersonalised. As long as you see a doctor or a psychologist or a nurse, you're regarded to have been treated, whereas actually you need continuity of relationship. So basically public policy ignores the meaning of worth that people subjectively feel. I'll just give an example. If you're disabled, for one person the meaning of being disabled might mean they'll become a Paralympian. For someone else it means they're going to go to Dignitas and end their life. Now, is that a medical difference, or is it a difference in the meaning that we make of our situations? Obviously, the meanings we make of our situations depend on our previous life history. In my experience, people who have absolutely no good input as a child probably end up not even consulting help. They just kill themselves without even meeting them. Basically, and all the psychotherapies, they're all about meaning. Cognitive behavioural therapy about appraisal, dynamic therapy about relationships, family therapy is about narrative. So any kind of therapy is about trying to connect with the meaning of someone's life and to look at that, to develop that. But our public health policy doesn't even address any of that stuff. So therefore, the fact that men and women might make a different meaning when they're feeling, say you abuse a male child or a female child, you might start to get differences in the way you respond to that, the way you act in relation to feeling bad about yourself. You might act differently or have different meaning about what it is to feel vulnerable, might be different for a male than a female. These are important questions. And our public health policy is not really empathic, it's not personalised, it's just completely emotionally illiterate.
Just to make a point about the questions that you might ask patients related to their well-being. There is a move at the moment, there's kind of a campaign for all NHS psychiatric patients to be asked whether they've been, sorry, I said all, not all, only the women should be asked whether they've been abused at any point in their life. And apparently there's no point in asking men about that. That seems to be another type of blindness.
Yeah, another example.
Did you want to take that? Or is it just kind of... Oh, okay.
Right, so let's just look at suicide and other troubles of the male gender. And as I say, we're not ignoring female troubles, there's plenty of those too. But if you look at every age group, every country except I think a bit of China, every point in history since records began, you've got a greater male suicide rate than female. So that's clearly a pattern in our species that's quite important. It's cross-cultural, it's not, you can't argue that's cultural. There's cultural variation, but the fact that in every single culture, bar one, and every single point in history, in every single age group, you've got a higher rate for male than female, means that's an important scientific difference in our species. Any other sort of scientific arena, they'd be straight on that as a massive issue. Using figures, I mean, you get different calculations, but 78% of suicides in the UK, according to that year, were male, but it's roughly that. It's been about that for a few years. Deaths at work, 97, this is another one people find interesting. If you look at deaths at work, 97% of deaths at work are male. Which is telling us something about our society and the gender patterns of how we expect people to live. 70%, 75% of drug and alcohol addiction, that's roughly a rough figure, is male. 85% of rough sleeping. You get the drift. There's all these issues. University admissions are less for males. Prison population's almost exclusively male. Lower life expectancy. If you're interested in health and you're interested in gender, these are things that should interest you. But this is the second blindness that we've been talking about, which all these statistics pretty much get ignored in public policy and strategy, even though half of all citizens are male. So there's a sort of big picture that gets left out. All these elements are there. I remember once saying to the Tsar for Mental Health, I think he was still the Tsar at the time, I said it, Lewis Appleby, I said, we've got men account for the more homeless, prisons, this, that and the other, and I said, where's our strategy for men? And he said, well, we've got a strategy for prisoners, we've got a strategy for homeless, so we don't need one. Well, it's a measure of how far we've come in the last 5 or 6 years that now Parliament is debating this. So all of the people, us, people in this room, you, we've all been chipping away at this subject and we're making progress. But there is an assumption that only the female gender can be vulnerable or carry disadvantages through gender. So even the sort of fact that we've just been celebrating Remembrance Day with all the soldiers that died, most of whom were men. Obviously, there were lots of brave female nurses and many women sacrificing many things. But the vast majority of soldiers were men. And about 40% of the soldiers in the First World War didn't have the vote. So even that gets ignored. Because I think a lot of people are surprised when you say that. But actually, the soldiers that died in the First World War didn't have the vote either.
It's incredible that, the first time I heard it was when you said it about a couple of years ago. It's incredible that this seems to be some sort of hidden knowledge. Why is that?
Well, it's just because the big picture is that suffrage was a gender issue, but actually it's more complex than that. And of course, women didn't have the vote and needed the vote, so that's important. But the fact that the working class guys didn't have it either is kind of, that gets forgotten. And of course, once you allow for the fact that working class men didn't have the vote, then the whole complexity of that narrative has to be changed. And we have a ministry called Women and Inequalities. So the problem is that we're linking inequality on gender purely to one gender. So once you've done that, it's a blindness to the other gender. We're also more tolerant of risk and harm to adult males and less sympathetic to the idea of a vulnerable adult male than a vulnerable woman. So what I'm saying here is that there's still a women and children first thing in our species. And even if you look at, say, the figures for survival of the Titanic, I think if you 97% of the women travelling first class survived the Titanic, which is quite a staggering thing because you think the Titanic is sort of killing everybody. Actually, they put the women and children first in the boats, and I think the men travelling first class was only about 30-something% survived. Men travelling second class, I think only 8% survived. Nearly all the children survived. So there's a kind of women and children first mentality, which you could argue is a good thing. If you have that, though, you've got to be honest that that's what you're doing. So it ends up with this elephant in the room, usual picture. Let's put some kind of humorous picture up, but it's not a very humorous subject, really. Yeah, basically, the male gender is a bit of an elephant. People kind of assume it's a man's world, but when you look at it, actually, it's not quite the case. So, hang on, I think we had that, haven't we? Yeah, we're going backwards. Oh, here we are. We've had that. Let's... Hang on, where am I going backwards?
Yeah, I think it's the middle block before us.
Oh, but it's...
It's a bit...
No, it's...
Is it?
No, it's the other button. Sorry about this, folks. Here we go. Right, so what are the big causes of male gender blindness then? If we are so blind to the male gender, why? Why is that? Obviously there's a gender narrative that it focuses mainly on female disadvantage. It's become a sort of mainstream narrative, so it creates a sort of framework. Well, you can't even do research unless you're not funded, are you? Unless you kind of go with this mainstream approach that there's female gender disadvantage and we've got to create, you've got to achieve equality for females, and therefore the assumption is that there aren't any male issues to look at. And of course there are many female issues that do need work on, so it's not that, it's just that you need to do both. And of course, what I would argue is there are male archetypes in the human species. It's become unfashionable in science now to talk about drives. You know, people talk about a maternal instinct. Oh, you know, you're not allowed to do that anymore. Freud and Jung, people like that, they talked about drives and instincts. And these are, what is a drive or an instinct? It's something that's a bit more than a socially learned thing. It's a kind of inbuilt in the species. And of course, I would argue that there are drives amongst men to provide and protect. On average, of course, you know, not all men are the same, not all women are the same, but there is an archetype of drive in the male half of the species to protect and provide, as there are these are evolutionary pressures. And we've seen it in all the figures we've given, you know, the Titanic and everything, that fits that theory. So basically, society has kind of accepted that the male is there to provide and protect. And that's shown in those deaths at work figures. 97% of deaths at work are male, but there's no public health strategy about that. Which means as a society we tolerate that because that's seen as normal because of this evolutionary pressure for men to provide and protect.
Martin, in fact, when you talked about that finding about 97% of deaths being male workplace deaths, somebody came up to me after that talk and said, well, you know, it's 97% of only a few people, which is a bit remarkable. I mean, it's 3 men per week, but I mean, which is...
Yeah, it's all of the health safety executive figures for all of workplace place deaths in the country in a year.
Yeah.
So it's a large number of people, but even one is, you know, it's a percentage that's based on a sample that's quite big.
My point being, it seems amazing to kind of quibble over that.
But yeah, it's kind of, there is this issue that it's like anything that's uncomfortable, people just want to sort of deny it. But these are facts, and they're not opinions, they are facts. So what I'm trying to say here is male mental health becomes the biggest taboo ever because it breaks 4 rules. The first taboo about male suicide and male mental health is that it goes against the male archetype. If you're a man, you're supposed to be protecting everyone else. You're not supposed to be weak. So if you're a man, you soldier on in private with your uncomfortably shameful feelings, and you kind of hope to find some solution, but it dishonours you to reveal your need. It makes you feel like you're less of a man because the male archetype is telling you you should be strong. Then you've got the the sort of more political narrative, if you like, or the socio-political narrative that says that women are victims, but men aren't victims. So therefore, in that narrative, men are seen as privileged and powerful, which of course some men really are, I mean, there's no denying that, but men as a whole are seen as privileged and powerful. And that means that you can't be a man who isn't privileged or powerful, because, you know, if you're suicidal, that's your fault kind of thing, or you shouldn't even be suicidal. It's not an issue to feel sympathetic towards, because we've got a women victim narrative and we've got a male archetype. They're two very powerful things that collude with each other. Then the third taboo is the mind blindness. If depression's a mental illness and that causes you're suicidal because you're depressed, and you're depressed because you've got an illness, and that's making you have symptoms of low self-esteem, which of course, as we said earlier, is a very bad model, but it keeps going in our society. Then the meaning of suicide isn't so important. The fact that a male and a female might interpret feeling low in different ways becomes less relevant. And then finally, it's stigma. It's stigmatising for anyone to have a mental health problem. If you're a woman, it's stigmatising, so for a man it's even more so. You know, and I keep talking to the charities on mental health saying, stop using this 1 in 4, it's just rubbish. Because 4 in 4 people are suicidal if you take away certain basic things that they need. You know, we'd all be suicidal tomorrow if certain things happened. So you can't address suicide unless you've actually recognised it as a problem and as a gender issue. If you don't think it's a gender issue, you're not going to address it. And because of our assumptions and our archetypes and our social and political policies, we're blind to male suicide, even though it's staring us in the face. So what John and I are arguing today is we need to start looking at the wood, not the trees, the bigger picture. And not so much look at men, but as our attitudes to men. And there is some change now in public attitudes, but it's slow. But as we've been saying today, there's a debate in Parliament, you know, this is great. So we are getting somewhere. But there is resistance to it. But by coming to this talk, you're part of the change, so thank you for being here. But what we're left with, if we want to address male suicide, then is two fundamental choices, I think, that we have to make. One is that we have to change men and masculinity. It's like, come on guys, open up sort of philosophy, which you see an awful lot in the charities and in mental health services. Come on guys, you're just being a bit macho, come on, open up. Or B, we have to change society's attitudes and responses to men and start listening to the way they're actually behaving and communicating, and tailor our response and honour their gender.
I think that's a really important point you're making there. That it's not all just everyone should take some responsibility for how they're feeling, their mental health, their physical health, but really it's not just men. It's a whole cultural thing, isn't it?
Yeah, we've just gone through those political, social, archetypal reasons why men are in a position where it's not going to be easy for them to seek help. But if you say men aren't seeking help because men are just too macho, I mean that isn't ever going to solve it. You're actually shaming men for not seeking help. So you're shaming men if they do seek help, and shaming them if they don't. So obviously we are making the wrong choice in my view so far. It's beginning to change, and these talks that we're doing are part of that process. But even mental health charities and the professionals, and certainly the media, are going for option A, which is really this. Guys, you're emotionally illiterate. You know, you don't know how to deal with your feelings. Come on, get a bit more emotionally literate. You're a bit macho. You need to open up, share your feelings, soften up, come out of the patriarchy, get into being a bit more modern man, you know, get into your feelings. The services are there, you've just got to go out and use them. That's the message we're giving men. It isn't really very welcoming. And the reasons that option won't work is this. For a start, it's bad science. It's confusing nature and nurture. It's ignoring biology and evolution. It's dismissing differences between the genders. And it's actually treating men as emotionally illiterate when it's society that's emotionally illiterate. Because society isn't sophisticated enough to see that men and women have evolved to process emotions differently. Same emotions, same importance, but the way they process them can be different. And of course, I'm not all men are the same, and I'm a guy that has been in therapy and this, that, and the other. Most of us in this room are probably not typical because we're at this talk, but at the end of the day, there are average differences. The whole thing about science is that differences are between averages, they're not differences between everything. It confuses stereotypes with archetypes. Therefore, if you're a woman these days and you want to stay at home and raise your kids, you're regarded as some kind of failure, even though you're pursuing a maternal archetype to drive to rear children. And if you're a man and you want to protect people instead of be vulnerable, you're seen as some kind of Neanderthal man. We're blaming the victim here. I mean, we're telling men, you know, come on guys, you're killing yourselves, but it's your own fault, you should be opening up more. So, I mean, I can't think of many other messages for groups that need help that blames the people they're trying to offer the help to. Then it reinforces the very attitudes to masculinity that increase suicide risk in the first place. And of course it's a double message, it's a double bind, because by not doing anything about deaths at work and all these other things we've highlighted, you're saying to men, it's okay for you to die at work. That's, you know, that's not an issue for public health. So the ultimate double bind, I mean, double bind theory, some of you know, came from sort of family therapy and kind of, but basically R.D. Laing used it quite a lot to explain how people are driven mad, you know, so this is driving men mad, I think, this double bind. This is the first message is open up, talk, share your feelings, we really care about you. The second message is don't expect any sympathy, we're not really listening to or protective of males, we don't care about you. So men are getting a double message.
Really interesting. I mean, there's probably a lot of scope for identifying several different powerful knots and binds that around men and masculinity these days.
So I think that's a very powerful double bind. So you're half trying to open up as a guy and half trying to sort of protect yourself. So really the rest of this talk is about how we make option B work. So as I say, if you don't believe in option B, look away now. Because obviously I don't think option A's got much mileage in it. Option B boils down to let's respect difference, because we do in every other field. If someone's different ethnicity, different age, different culture, different religion, we think difference is really good. You know, we're all equal but different. When it comes to gender, we can't say that. We can't say we're equal but different. We say we're equal but we're not different, we're just equal. And because we've done that with gender, we've made it very hard to even look at the things which are in front of our noses. So option B boils down to let's respect differences, tune into male needs and communication styles and adapt services to suit them rather than trying to neutralise or demasculinize males. I mean, there's a number of papers which have shown that traditional psychology, counselling services, mental health services are more suited to a typical female way of dealing with distress than a male way. Obviously some men are very, I mean, people like me, I spent my life doing therapy, receiving it, talking about it, but I'm not a typical male. And of course there are some women that don't like that kind of way of dealing with things either. So, but on average, men are more likely to not find counselling and direct eyeballing people and talking about your feelings very easy or comfortable. It's not because they're failing to be emotionally literate, it's because it goes against their way of dealing and processing their issues. Option B in a nutshell is really, men aren't emotionally illiterate, they're differently literate. In other words, men are not Neanderthals. They deal with their feelings in a different way, which has a different which once you work with it actually is equally valuable. It also means difference should be respected and honoured to connect with any human being or any sentient being. I mean, if you're going to rescue an animal, you think about what the animal's environment you need to get right for the animal so that they're comfortable. But with men, we think, you know, come on guys, start doing some counselling, you're depressed, get on with it. We don't think, what's an environment that's going to suit a male client? So men have different ways of showing, communicating, responding to distress. On average, they do. Hi there, please. No, don't worry, we've still got plenty to go. So why not offer services that take account of difference? And if we didn't do that, surely we're failing in our duty of care to a group that is clearly at risk from all the statistics on whom other lives are both. Because you know, men, they have daughters, they have sons, they have wives, partners, they have, you know, whether they're gay or straight, they have people in their lives. So if you don't sort out men in that, we're damaging all of us, because male gender is part of all of us. It's who we are a gendered species. So what we've got to do is start to detoxify society's attitudes to masculinity, not change men. This is the argument. And then the services will start to reflect that. What we're doing, I'm trying to explain how our attitudes to males have got toxic. And I think this is very important. We're taking the most extreme damaged men, who are rapists or who are killers, or who are damaged, who are extremely macho, and we're assuming that that is somehow representative of the gender. Because of that, bad men are seen as typical rather than exceptional. I'll give you a really good example of this, which is very distressing to me and to all of us. This poor girl was raped and murdered by a very damaged man recently. Her name was India Chupchase, and her father, when he was in all the media at the time, saying, "I'm never going to walk my daughter down the aisle." He loved his daughter with a passion. That was his special child, his daughter. And he was very, very moving if you listen to him on the media. But then I was listening to many media reports covering that event, and everyone was saying, we've got to go into schools now and teach boys to respect girls. In other words, our attitudes in society, as reflected in the media, are that the rapist is more typical of a man than the father. Now what I would be doing is going to all our schools and saying to our young boys, congratulations lads, you're going to turn out like that father. You're going to have kids and you're going to love them. A few of you are going to be damaged and you're going to be rapists. That's bad. But that's not the typical man, that's the extreme end of the spectrum, because when men are damaged emotionally, they act in different ways than when women are damaged emotionally, and that is true. But the idea that somehow rape is sort of being treated as if it's a typical thing amongst men, rather than the actions of certain damaged men.
It's a bit like that film's quite popular at the moment, The Mask You Live In, and it's all about toxic masculinity, and it kind of presents its case as if it applies to all men, seems to invite all men to learn something from it. But when it gives examples of toxic masculinity, it goes to prisons, basically, or goes to frat house parties and kind of examples of rapes and stuff like that, and crazy stuff that goes on. It doesn't really, it seems to take a small element of the badness about some men and generalise it to all men. It seems very, very damaging message.
Well, it's bad science, because obviously, you know, because of physiological and evolutionary reasons, all kinds of reasons, rape is, you know, something that damaged men do. But the idea that that then becomes seen as a wider representative issue of the gender rather than as a gender-specific response in certain damaged people, that's where our science goes wrong, and that's where our attitudes go wrong. And of course, it's not good for our young men to receive all these kind of lectures, because it's just, it really makes their esteem in themselves lower, or it makes them more bravado, you know. It kind of doesn't help. but blaming the male gender itself, not the emotional damage for the gender way males respond to damage, is obviously a big problem. Toxic attitudes continue. I was asked to debate at the Cambridge Union as one of a number of speakers the motion. This House believes that masculinity is harmful for everyone. Can you imagine that motion being debated about any other group? So again, it shows that it's not men who are the issue, it's us as a society, including men, because men see male gender like this too. It's men and women in society collectively have a view that masculinity is harmful. The motion even was carried. So not only was it debated, and of course the motion got distorted into macho behaviour is harmful, and of course it is. But again, can you see that even Cambridge University, which is full of fairly intelligent people, couldn't see the difference between macho men and all men? Because, you know, we get the... and again, this thing with misandry and misogyny, there's loads of misogyny, clearly there is, but there was a politician, I think she was even running to become Prime Minister, wasn't she? Andrea Leadsom. She said, I wouldn't leave my kids with a man, maybe it could be a paedophile. So she'd gone from an extreme, tiny minority of men to all men. Some professor said something about women and men in laboratories and it not working, and he ends up losing his job. I think Andrea Leadsom's still in, she was never disciplined over that. So it shows that we tolerate greater sexism, even though the perception is that sexism is against women and not against men. When you start drilling down to the truth, it's both. You know, sexism works against men as well. And of course we get the Grayson Perry sort of thing. Grayson Perry's an alpha male, so he can do what he likes. But he's used as a reason to attack masculinity rather than an example of its variability. He's a man. I mean, David Bowie was a man who liked to experiment with things because he was creative. But that's an example of men being variable, not an example of that's a good person because he's not like a typical man. I mean, it's just men are variable, they're not all the same. And of course, what we're not doing is I can't think of anything in our society where we're celebrating males. This might be an opportunity for anyone to come up with an example, but even Remembrance Sunday, we didn't say thank you males. We didn't honour the gender side of the soldiers, we just said soldiers. And that's, you know, interesting. We didn't make it a gender issue. And we don't really, I don't see anything that celebrates masculinity at all at the moment. Masculinity is either not talked about or it's talked about as a sort of toxic thing. So all these guys that sacrificed their lives for us are not honoured in their gender. Their gender is sort of airbrushed out. So I'm saying it's bad for all of us to get this wrong. It's not anyone, no one wins. We're a dysfunctional society if we can't honour all our members equally. So services aren't respecting, they're actually dishonouring masculinity and male gender differences. Any other group would get tailored services, and we do, you know, we need to tailor services to specific groups. And as we've said before, there's a study there that there will be references at the end, and I think we can give copies of these slides, can't we? Anyone who wants copies of these slides can get them.
And we're going to put them, we'll put them on the Male Psychology website, www.malepsychology.org.
So you can get all the references, everything. And also you might want to go away after this talk and digest. You probably find you've got criticisms of what I'm saying. It's hard to think of a riposte, isn't it? A riposte in the moment, you know. And we need to learn from these things, but, you know, this isn't all. I'm sure not everything I've said is spot on, but the point is that you need to go away and respond perhaps afterwards, or send us some comments.
I think a lot of this material will be very challenging for lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's challenging for me to talk about.
It's just a different way of looking at the world. I mean, when you say it's an elephant in the room, you're saying it's something massive that people don't seem to see. And they can't see it for a reason. I think people
Yeah.
may be quite uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So
there is positive evidence that if you start to design services to fit men and boys, you start getting results. So we haven't got loads of evidence because we're not doing it for the reasons we've already said, but where we are starting to do it, Campaign Against Living Miserably, you might have heard of that, Jane Powell, who's a feminist, it's often the feminists who are more ahead of the rest of us, in some ways, in talking about this stuff, because they kind of felt, well, what about men? They were thinking about gender more than anyone else. Man Talk Central London Samaritans, which Michael in our audience here was involved in setting up with me and others, and we found we got the Samaritans volunteers actually started spending longer on the phones with men once we'd done a few workshops on just gender and men and how they, we didn't teach them anything, did we? We just ran a few mind awareness raising things, and we found all the volunteers really started listening to men differently, and the men started talking differently because they were being listened to differently. The Eaton Foundation is the first mental health foundation specifically for men. Men's Shed, there's men's groups. I've run a men's group, and probably some of you in this room run men's groups. When you start using things that men work with, like sport, like you go into sports clubs, it starts to get somewhere, you start to get guys doing stuff, Barbers and hairdressers, particularly in certain cultures, a really fantastic way of connecting with men in a way that honours their gender and doesn't make them feel uncomfortable. Where you're working with veterans and military personnel who've suffered PTSD, if you do it in a male-friendly way, it's really effective. In Canada, they have a team of people, don't they, who actually work with guys in groups. They keep them in their combat units and they go through the trauma with all the guys standing around them, talking through what's going through their mind and reenacting it in a drama sort of way. But that process is the trauma, but it's a way where your comrades are around you. It's not sitting in a room talking to a therapist. It's a different model.
I was just going to say, Mark Westwood, who's the person you're talking about delivering that combat veteran program, is going to be doing a workshop in Britain next year. I think Roger Kingerly is organising that one. But sometime, if you're interested in this sort of thing, it's an excellent opportunity to find out how to help men with combat stress.
And I think you had an example, Michael, of Transport for London. Did you want to mention that?
Yeah, I have a friend who's actually a nutritionist, and she works with men. Jessica works with men in Transport for London. They're guys who, and it is actually all men, the particular bit she does, who repair the tracks in the middle of the night. So they tend to do shifts from about, I don't know, on the tubes, stop the Windsor, stop about midnight till 7 in the morning. Something like that's the shift they do. So she comes along ostensibly to be talking about nutrition, so you can go and have a chat about nutrition, but she finds that men, given the opportunity to sit with someone who's an empathetic listener, talk about all sorts of things which have nothing to do particularly with nutrition, like family life and the difficulties of doing very late shifts. But the point is, she comes to them.
Yeah, she's in their place of work.
Workplace, so no one has to know what they're talking about, and it's within the confines of work, so they don't have to take time off to go.
And it's the way of the work is saying to the men, we honour you and we support you. So it's kind of,
and of course, no one's saying come and talk about your feelings.
Yeah, and it's
no
not
one's saying that.
stigmatised.
They're saying come and have a chat, and then people do, it seems, feel very comfortable to just talk to them.
great. Thank you.
Anecdotal, but it works.
Well, yeah, life's ultimately mainly anecdotal. Science is just adding all the anecdotes up to a big pan. So what would a male-friendly service look like? It's early days, and you in this room will be hopefully contributing to the creativity of how we do this. But the evidence so far suggests we need to just, whilst not ignoring mainstream counselling and therapy, it's very valuable, and I've used it myself, and I think a lot of men do, but because of the statistics, we need to think beyond just that. I think it needs to involve no immediate pressure to